Oh, wow. A lot of people. So hello, everyone, and thank you for coming to, I think it's going to be one of the least technical panels of today. And thanks to our little friend. Not so little, but quite. So before we get to actual questions and the topic of like what dynamic NFTs are, like let's introduce ourselves, like starting with Josh.
Yeah, for sure. So I'm Josh Owen. I'm the co-founder of TradePort. We also run Indexer. So TradePort's a multi-chain NFT aggregator. We aggregate NFTs all across the Sui ecosystem. And then we also run Indexer. So if you're a developer and want to plug into kind of the NFT ecosystems from a dev tooling standpoint, we have that as well.
Great. I'm Bryan. I'm part of Hyperspace. We're a multi-chain marketplace. I'm actually not a co-founder, but a real founder is back there in Santosh. Shout out Santosh. And yeah, super happy to be here on Sui.
And Bryan.
Hey, I'm Bryan Lee, CTO at SM. We do NFT collections as well as working with other brands on their technology strategy as well. And yeah, that's me.
And my name is Damir. I'm a Move developer, like software engineer at Mysten Labs. Yeah, pretty much it. So the topic of today's conversation, just look at that. The topic of today's conversation is dynamic NFTs. It is something that I never understood because a lot of people come to Sui conferences, like build their houses, and then they're like, wow, you have dynamic NFTs. But what is dynamic NFTs really? Are there static NFTs? What's the big deal here? Can you guys explain?
Yeah, I think before the two big brains talk about it at a technical level, the way that I explain it to, I think, friends that typically ask from the outside, like, what do NFTs do? The ones that they're most used to are ones that are static or not changing in nature. And many times they're used more for collectibles or representing yourself on a PFP. I'm sure many of you guys have seen Bored Ape Yacht Club as a prime example of ones that just remain as the original picture. DNFTs in change are by definition dynamic, and they're ever-changing technically based on conditions or circumstances that you designate. And happy to give more examples for specific communities later. But I think if anything, it really embodies what NFTs are supposed to be, which is fully embracing on-chain data and being able to reflect that data onto the asset that you own. Because in reality, all the assets that we own in real life are never static, and they're constantly changing based on the circumstances that you're going through or the circumstances that the object is going through.
Yeah, I think for me, the biggest difference between a static versus a dynamic one is which layer are you tokenizing exactly. So for the static one, the only thing you're really tokenizing on chain is who owns it. And what you end up tokenizing is the reference to something that's off-chain. Meanwhile, a dynamic one, both the ownership aspect as well as what the asset actually is both on-chain. And that's powerful because when you both have the who owns it as well what it actually is, if both are on-chain, it means the other aspects of the chain can both read the data as well as change it. So in terms of building a virtual world, I just don't think the static way you can really do much with it, which is probably why kind of the biggest use case that we've seen for it is just pointing to art off chain. Yeah, so I can talk a bit more about that in a bit, but I'm curious what Josh says. Yeah,
I think it's pretty interesting on that point, where what's really nice about having everything on-chain, so metadata, attributes, if it's an image for pictures, et cetera, is when we look at static NFTs, say everybody's probably been on OpenSea and there's a little refresh column to see if the metadata has changed. They've got to go to IPFS, see if the pointer's changed, et cetera. What happens inside the ecosystem, there's a break. Let's say that OpenSea hasn't refreshed and Blur has. So you have the same asset represented on multiple sites inside the ecosystem and they're showing different metadata. When you bring all the metadata on-chain, if any refresh happens, the entire ecosystem updates at once. And that's very powerful just for both from a user standpoint, but also if you're a developer, you don't have to worry about are people going to see the live most updated version of this NFT. And also NFTs are assets, right? So of course, we've done a lot of trading of monkey pictures, as all of us here probably have. But NFTs are assets on chain, right? So fungible tokens are kind of currencies. NFTs are assets. If we want to do things like your Netflix subscription being an NFT, right, you're going to want that to be dynamic. How much time do you have left on that subscription, et cetera? So that's how I would explain it.
Just to clarify, is it for metadata updates that you have to refresh?
On like Ethereum or like
Yeah, on Ethereum.
Yeah.
Oh, so if the metadata got updated, there's actual delay between marketplaces can actually index the off-chain metadata?
For sure.
Correct.
Oh, interesting. Okay. So, but then why is Sui special in that regard? Like, why have I not even noticed that there are static NFTs, in other words?
So to take that one, I think Sui and basically all hyperchains are very special two ways. One, you have speed, but then you also have like very low transaction costs. So you take like legacy blockchains or just blockchains in general with fairly high transaction costs, it's too expensive to put that data on chain. Like that's why the standards were built in such a way that we're always pointing to IPFS or we're pointing to off-chain. It's just too expensive to store that data. It's so expensive, in fact, that OpenSea wasn't even putting pricing data on chain, right? Like your listings weren't on chain. So Sui's got a couple things going for it. One, transaction costs are extremely low. Obviously, we have high latency, or we have very low latency, which means you can put everything on chain and it's not going to be expensive. Obviously, Studio Mirai can talk about this. They put all the art on chain. And that's very big for unlocking a lot of applications. Obviously, Sui is big on gaming. You cannot do that on any other chain with high transaction costs.
I also think on a foundation/labs perspective, from the very start, Mysten and Sui Foundation made it a mission for DNFTs to be implemented. And I think on a integrations or even operational standpoint, that's special given that a lot of projects have that in mind while building their projects out and recognize that the help is available, the docs and resources are available, where other chains might not have that from the start. Of course, they recognize the value of dynamic NFTs. They might brand it a little different. So I think in that perspective, there's already a ecosystem-wide understanding, or at least attempt to try to understand what it is. And I'll speak on, I guess, question number 5 on various blue chip projects in the ecosystem that have already integrated it. And it's quite essential to the utility that the NFTs bring, and not just another gimmick that they're layering on to showcase Sui technology.
Yeah, I think I can speak a bit about the developer. So we're still talking about like how Sui is different from other chains, right? Yeah. Question number 3. All right. Yeah. Since like I did most of the smart contract work for all the stuff that we're working on, I found that when we're thinking about use cases like gaming and consumer especially, I find the best way to build really is to be able to drop yourself into a virtual world and see like what things should look like. And on account-based chains, where the whole premise of it is basically mapping a key to something else, it's really difficult to build something that you feel like you can touch and you can feel. So for me, when I approach building on Sui, it's like being able to drop down into that world and think like, okay, I want this building to look exactly like this and be able to build it exactly. Is really huge. And the other aspect of Sui that is really powerful for us especially, the distinguishing between an object that you can own, an object that can be shared, and one that can't be changed. Like if you think about it, everything in life is kind of like that. Like even when we came into this conference today, this room is shared. We had to have our badge to come in. That's something you own, and you show at the door to come in. So to be able to replicate all of these workflows and flows that we know in real life directly on Sui without having to do some like mental gymnastics basically to replicate that on an account-based chain is really just incredible.
Yeah, I can definitely relate to the objectivization from developer perspective, who actually wants to understand how this thing works.
Yeah.
Because the native notion of transfer is super great because I just transfer it to you.
Yeah.
I don't need to reinvent transfer. That's one of the greatest things that we add to Move, or the Move has now. So what about true ownership? Like that's a little spicy topic, especially when it comes to NFTs and marketplaces. So we also have it, right? Because when I transfer an asset to someone else, but it kind of creates certain problems for marketplaces, or not for marketplaces, but probably to collection launch. And I would be interested to hear your, Bryan, perspective on this, because if you got metadata wrong, which is what normally happens, and I see the guy smiling, is it really like that big of a problem that you cannot access users' assets?
You?
I think that's a you guys brought question.
Maybe that's more of a marketplace question, right?
Maybe it's an
That's only a
index
launchpad
question.
Yeah. So I mean, it depends on the collection owner. If you're launching an NFT collection, I just want to recommend triple check everything. It is, if you do it wrong on launch, it's very hard to go back. So, that's kind of that's the problem. It's not the problem. That is a bug. That is a feature inside blockchains. It's a little bit different on Sui because you can actually update objects. But like if you go to ETH and you screw up your contract, there's no updating that contract, right? On Sui, you can actually go in, you can update the modules, etc. But yeah, I would say it's a two-edged sword. As a user, you want the security. If you buy an asset, that asset's not going to change on you because the project lead decides to rug you, or the project lead decides to do something out of your control when you own that item. But as a project lead, you kind of philosophically own that project, right? It's your creative expression, or it's your company. Like you're doing subscriptions as NFTs. You want to have flexibility over the things that you own to be able to update them. So it's kind of this constant edge case. I think it's really dependent on the domain. But since the current meta of NFTs is mainly around art and communities, we do see that tension between the community owner and the person who owns an asset quite a lot.
Oh, interesting. And speaking of communities, like what do dynamic NFTs, like getting back on the main track, like what do they actually bring to communities? Like why dynamic NFTs are great for communities?
Yeah, I think
if they are great.
A number of things, and I reached out to Typus Finance and Cosmicadia, two I think prime examples of implementing NFTs on Sui, and they shared pretty similar interests as to why they're integrating the feature into their project. And one actually an aspect that I didn't really think about was the attachment that owners got to the NFT as it was changing. So think of like a pair of sneakers, I guess like these, that formulate to you. Of course, people like new sneakers, but they also like the sneakers that you've worn out and have fit to your shoe, or a car that you've customized that has changed over time because it's partnered with you. And I think in that same regard, the NFT that you've leveled up or you've been with for a long time, and it shows that it's been dynamic, as you've also been dynamic, attaches a philosophical and almost an emotional attachment to it, a nerdy emotional attachment. And additionally, it incorporates and unlocks an ability for you to grow with it as you level up with it. So in both cases of the projects that I mentioned, there's different perks that you gain in the platforms that these NFTs are part of, and you only get that by visually being able to see the NFTs change along with your leveling up or putting points into the NFT. One thing that we've been suggesting as the Sui Ambassador program was rolling out, and I've been talking to Brandon about it, would be an ability for ambassadors or people, KOLs in the ecosystem, to have an NFT that represented their membership within the ambassador program, and having that also grow over time based on IRL meetups or interacting with other ambassadors. I think that's another key point of the NFTs, where you not only want it to exist on its own and grow on its own, but I guess kind of to Bryan's point, have it be integrated in this consumer-focused world and have it interact with each other. So I think the unlock is a reflection of the IRL asset ownership, not even meta, but philosophy that's existed since the beginning of humankind, where you're not owning a static object that just retains the same attributes forever. You want it to grow alongside you and change the same that you are changing. And I think that gets you to be more of a owner as opposed to simply a holder.
So is it like, so if I dressed up my copy, then like it's more mine than just the copy that was just minted?
I think it's very similar to a Tamagotchi, if you guys are old enough for that.
Oh, interesting. So the same principle that like I played this game for quite some time, and like I have my character and all my loot and everything, and I just love the sword and everything. So it stays with dynamic NFTs, even though they not necessarily have this like gaming base where you experience something. So it goes from communities, it seems.
Correct.
Wow, interesting. That is indeed interesting. And Bryan, I would be very interested to hear your perspective on like how it applies from the builder perspective, and which features of Sui and like actual dynamic NFTs you use.
Oh, okay. So for our most recent collection, we kind of explored almost every aspect of Sui, from the language itself to deploying, the nodes in a way to support what we're trying to do, as well as to just use as much as possible to build out the feature. So like one aspect of Sui that I think has been mostly unexplored or even misunderstood to some extent has been the difference between the consensus path and fast path. There's often talk on Twitter that fast path is useless, and that's just not the case at all. So for our collection, one thing we really want to do was store the art on chain, because we feel like if we're so obsessed about the tracking who owns it on chain, it's like why isn't the asset itself on chain? Like it's kind of strange to me. So we wanted to experiment with like, okay, if we wanted to upload all of our pictures to Sui, what would that look like? So the first version of that used a consensus path way of doing it, and it was just very, very slow. Because we basically, for each picture, we split it into a bunch of chunks and then upload each chunk at a time. And in order to get past the object contention, because two transactions cannot touch the same thing at the same time, and we only have one picture, that means at one time we can only upload one chunk. So we designed it a different way, using FastPath instead, and it sped it up like 1,500 times. So to be able to do stuff like that, I think is really interesting. Yeah, and I mean, in terms of like which features, it was like just like we used everything. So we'll be open sourcing our code for that as well in a few weeks. So be on the lookout for that. Yeah.
With Mysten rolling out later this year, the consensus path will probably be quicker.
Yeah.
And the latencies are 75% lower.
Yeah.
So do you think it would change how you code on Sui or like how you build applications? That's like dev to dev.
Yeah, I think for the specific use case of uploading pictures, we would probably still use the fast path. Just to be able to basically upload every single chunk at once, but in terms of like other use cases that rely on objects that are shared, I guess it's like a 4x increase in speed, right? Is definitely going to be big, because if you're thinking about it, one of the biggest aspects of Sui for building consumer apps is the ability to chain a bunch of calls and then process that all at once. So to be able to do all of that in how fast did you say? Like 100 milliseconds?
I believe it was 100 to 300 milliseconds.
Yeah. So you're on an app and you click a button and it's gonna happen in that speed. I think that's huge.
Yeah, it is. But like at some point, eventually or naturally. By the way, how does it affect marketplaces? Like the transaction speeds and everything? Because I have to admit, I'm not a very crypto person, so sorry for that. And so like I'm a regular like internet user, right? So when I go on like any website to book a hotel or an airplane ticket, then it kind of like goes fast enough for me. So there's like a certain certain length or the duration of your operation, like the time that you can wait normally. Like, how does it work with the fast execution, really? How does it work on other networks? And like, is it really a game changer in the sort of like your NFT or marketplace experience when it comes to Sui?
Yeah, I mean, certainly as a multi-chain operator, we could say for a fact that Sui is incredibly fast. And I think one of the things that marketplaces, I'm sure Josh can attest, has a lot of problems with is indexing, just the ability to catch mints as they happen, and also parse data that goes back and forth between thousands of traders at certain points. But I think on Sui, even this week when Studio Mirai launched their, I'm going to botch their pronunciation, but the Machins, or the Machin in plural. It just simply takes an object ID or a token ID to index them. And we have infrastructure in place on Soda's Indexer / TradePort to have them be caught live and have all these transactions on chain be read. So I think in that sense, it's a very efficient measure of being able to do what in essence is the very basics of how NFTs should work. But I think the way that Sui works makes it a lot easier. And I think on top of that, the same thing would obviously attribute to DNFTs, where I think for DNFTs to really work, and perhaps a spicy take, but I think there needs to be not only marketplace infra, but wallet infrastructure and consumer product infrastructure where these DNFTs do update live across all these things. Because at the end of the day, if the platforms themselves don't reflect that, then they're nothing really more than static NFTs that have the ability to update over time. So I think it's a ecosystem-wide, I wouldn't say problem, but value add that we could incorporate this technology, but it requires, frankly, any platform that integrates NFTs, and specifically DNFTs, to update altogether for the same problem that Josh earlier mentioned to not happen.
I think on the consumer, speed really matters. So if you think of just as apps grow or ecosystems grow, transaction velocity. So as you reduce friction, so reducing the speed of transactions, as that goes down, transaction velocity goes up. So if you just think, let's just say like we're on Stacks. So Stacks is basically pegged to Bitcoin. So you have 30-minute block times, right? So obviously that's a other end of the bell curve on slow. Bitcoin's unbelievably slow. But if you think about that, if I'm a user and I sign a transaction, I wait 30 minutes for confirmation. How many transactions are you going to sign? Not a lot, right? Because let's say that you're doing 5 transactions. You want to make sure that those go through before you do other executions. As you start to shrink that down, transaction velocity goes up. And so we've found that, and anybody building dApps, I'd highly recommend spend a lot of time on this. As you reduce friction, one way to do that at the blockchain level is to reduce transaction times. User engagement goes up. Users are very impatient. So the difference between a transaction taking 500 milliseconds and say 10 seconds, which 10 seconds isn't a long time, 80% of those people are going to drop off, or they're not going to sign another transaction. And especially when you get into programmatic. So if we think of deep liquidity pools, especially around DEXs, if you're doing automated trading, or you want deep liquidity pools inside these markets, you will have a lot more liquidity in a market with low transaction times. So it's kind of like that base layer of removing friction.
Oh, interesting. I think I once used a marketplace. Sorry for that, just once. And I was very indecisive. I could not choose for which price to list, and so I'm listing, and then I'm cancel, and then I'm relisting. And so I just imagined myself doing the same thing with 30-minute confirmation time, and you actually need to think before doing something, right? And so for consumers, it may be easier to not think about things, unlike creators. All right, so we just flipped the game. So creators cannot change their mind now, but users can, and consumers can always change. So I wonder, that's the last question as we're closing. Coming to an end. If right now, there is still a big narrative, right, of what is a dynamic NFT and how it compares to static, and we still look at this narrative and we perceive it always comparing to how it was on on other networks. But I wonder, how do you see? Do you think that Sui world in many ways is going to be its own special world in terms of NFTs? Do you think there is something beyond just simple comparison of dynamic NFTs against static NFTs? Maybe something composable NFTs with dynamic fields. Maybe even standardizing them, because I do know that. For example, with Kiosk, which we never touched on today, we made it, and then we discovered that, hey, there's a whole bunch of different scenarios which we never thought about, because the only problem we were trying to solve was royalty enforcement, and now we just opened up the whole world of possibilities.
Plot twist. Y'all each have 15 seconds.
All right.
No, just do your closing thoughts if that's
Oh,
okay.
sure.
Yeah.
Yeah, I guess I can comment on this a bit. I think over time the term dynamic NFT will hopefully fade away, because what a dynamic NFT is just what an asset should be in the virtual world. So the idea that the asset is an asset instead of a reference or a pointer to an asset. So if we do succeed, it means this term will no longer be a thing, I think. Yeah.
I'll just do a random take of, as a self-centered person, I would love to turn myself into dynamic NFT and have people view how dynamic I've been in the past 26 years. And right now, not very possible on chain. So yeah, to Bryan's point, I think ideally the dynamic word gets dropped, the NFT word gets dropped, and it just becomes digitalized asset, or frankly, just anything you own on chain is of course by definition dynamic.
Yeah. Static NFTs they'll die off, basically.
No, let's just hope we won't have to do the panel on dynamic NFTs again eventually, because everyone is going to be like, why do we need to talk about it?
Yeah, all right.
All right, thank you guys for coming.
Thank you.
Thank you for the conversation. Thank you.
Thank you.
Oh, you're just so great, right?